close your eyes and imagine yourself standing in a medieval monastery, Milo invites you to discover what life was really like in the Middle Ages. Tonight, let us walk very slowly into the darkness of a medieval monastery. Let us leave behind the modern world with its easy light, its noise, its clocks glowing softly in the dark, and let us imagine instead a place of stone, timber, prayer, silence, and cold night air. A monastery after sunset was not usually a place of excitement. It was not filled with constant whispers, hidden passages, or endless chanting in every corridor. It was quieter than that, simpler than that, harsher too in some ways. And as the light faded, the whole shape of life within its walls began to change. The first thing to understand is the darkness itself. For us, darkness is rarely complete. Even at night, we are surrounded by some lingering brightness from windows, roads, lamps, and distant towns. But in the medieval world, once the sun had set and the last glow had drained from the sky, the darkness beyond a candle or a lamp could become almost total. And so, before we enter the monastery, we begin outside it, under the open sky, on the road that leads toward its walls. The air is cooler now. The earth beneath your feet feels uneven, perhaps damp from recent rain, perhaps dry and hard, perhaps touched by frost. Fields stretch away on either side, but in the darkness they are no longer fields as we see them by day. They have become open black spaces, quiet and uncertain, fading into the night. Somewhere far off, a dog barks. Somewhere else, perhaps from a distant village, there is the faint scent of wood smoke. If there is a moon, it lays a pale skin of light over the land. If there is no moon, then the road itself is only half visible, discovered step by step. Ahead, still dark but more solid than the land around it, rises the monastery. Not always vast, not always magnificent. But at night, even a modest monastery could seem immense, because its walls and roofs gathered the darkness into shape. They stood where the open countryside ended, and an enclosed, disciplined world began. That difference mattered deeply. Outside the walls was the ordinary world, with its travel, its trade, its weather, its dangers, its uncertainty, and its restless movement. Inside was a place ordered by rule, by bells, by prayer, by obedience, and by repetition. The monastery was not meant to escape the world entirely, but it was meant to resist its disorder. And by night, that contrast only grew stronger. As we draw closer, the outer wall becomes clearer. Perhaps it is stone, perhaps a combination of stone and timber, depending on the place and period we imagine. It is not necessarily defensive like the wall of a castle, yet it still marks a boundary. It tells you where one way of living ends and another begins. The gatehouse waits ahead. By day, it would have seen movement, servants, messengers, carts, guests, local people with business, perhaps the poor seeking alms, perhaps pilgrims hoping for shelter. But now the hour is late. The business of the day is over. Night has narrowed the world. The great wooden gate is closed. Iron bands cross its surface. The wood is thick, weathered, and dark. If a lamp burns nearby, its glow is small, touching only the immediate space around the doorway and leaving the rest in shadow. The porter, whose duty it is to watch and answer, is one of the few figures still associated with the edge between monastery and world. He does not throw the gate open carelessly. Night is a time for caution. In the medieval world, darkness was not merely scenic. It carried practical fears. A twisted ankle on an unseen path, a stranger whose intentions were unclear, a sudden storm, a misplaced flame, a thief, a cry in the distance that could not be easily traced. Night narrowed vision and expanded uncertainty. For the monks, and for many medieval people more broadly, darkness also carried moral and spiritual weight. It suggested vulnerability, temptation, the testing of vigilance, the limits of the body, the need for watchfulness. And yet, for the monastery, night was not something to flee from. It was something to live through in an ordered way. That is what makes this place so interesting after sunset. The gate opens, slowly, with the sound of wood shifting against wood, iron moving against iron, and at once the feeling changes. We cross the threshold, and the outer road is behind us. Inside, the monastery does not feel lively. It feels contained. The sounds are fewer now, more specific. A step in the distance, the movement of air along stone, the faintest creak from timber somewhere overhead. If there is speech at all, it is low and brief, because the time for talking is passing, or has already passed. We are not yet in the heart of the monastic complex, but already the outside world feels farther away than the distance of a single gate should allow. That is part of the power of enclosure. A monastery was a community arranged around a shared religious life. Men lived here not as isolated individuals, but as members of a house bound by rule and routine. Their days were structured by prayer at set hours, by work, by meals, by reading, by silence, and by obedience. There were differences from one monastery to another, of course. Some were wealthier, some poorer, some stricter, some more elaborate in worship, some more austere. But across those differences, night brought many of the same realities. Darkness, cold, bell-rung interruption, communal sleep, communal prayer. A life not drifting into rest, but passing through rest according to rule. That is the world we are entering. And so before we go any farther, let us picture the monastery as a whole, resting in the dark. There is the church, the spiritual center, where the night office will later draw the monks from their beds. There is the cloister, the square heart of movement and reflection, quieter now than it was by day. There is the refectory, where the evening meal has ended. There are kitchens and service rooms where fires are being banked or watched with care. There is the dormitory, where the monks will lie down, not for an uninterrupted night, but for a sleep that will be broken by prayer. There may be a guest house near the outer zone, where travelers rest separately from the monks. There may be an infirmary, gentler and warmer than some other places, where the weak and ill are cared for. All of it now is entering the deepening hush of night. And if we are to understand what nights were really like in a medieval monastery, we must move gently through these spaces, one by one, and allow them to become dark around us. So now, slowly, we begin with the threshold spaces, the places nearest the gate, where the outer world fades and the monastic night truly begins. Just inside the gate, near the edge of the monastic world, are the places where strangers might be received, delayed, questioned, or lodged for the night. This is important because not everyone who came to a monastery entered it in the same way. A monk belonged to the rhythm of the house. A guest did not. By day, the outer buildings of a monastery could be busy in a practical and modest way. A porter might answer requests. A servant might carry supplies. A messenger might wait for a reply. A traveler might arrive dusty, wet, or tired, asking for shelter. A local person might bring a matter of business. Someone poor might come in hope of food or assistance. Hospitality was a serious duty in many monastic traditions, but hospitality was also ordered, managed, and shaped by the life of the community. At night, those differences became even sharper. The guest house, if the monastery is large enough to have one, lies apart from the deepest and most enclosed spaces of monastic life. This separation is not hostility. It is structure. The monastery is open in one sense and guarded in another. It receives, but it does not dissolve its boundaries. Let us imagine a traveler already settled here for the night. He has eaten something plain and warm. Bread, perhaps, pottage, ale, or watered wine. He has been shown to a room or a shared sleeping space more comfortable than the open road, though still far simpler than modern comfort. There may be a narrow bed, a pallet, a bench, a blanket rougher than he would prefer, but welcome all the same. A shuttered opening admits no real view now, only darkness beyond. If a lamp was once burning, it may have been lowered or extinguished to save fuel and reduce risk. The guest lies down, grateful for walls, a roof, and some measure of safety. But what he hears in the night will not be the same as what a monk hears. He is near the edge. He is sheltered, yet not fully woven into the house. The sounds that reach him are partial and distant. Perhaps he hears the gate once more, firmly secured. Perhaps the fading clink of a vessel being set aside. Perhaps the low murmur of the last necessary exchange between those still moving about on duty. Then less and less. He may expect, as many of us would, that the monastery settles down and sleeps. And in one sense, it does, but not entirely. That is one of the quiet revelations of monastic night. It is not a simple descent from activity into unconscious rest. It is a controlled dimming, a pause within rhythm, a surrender of the body that remains answerable to the bell. The guest may not yet know this. He may drift toward sleep thinking he has entered a place of complete stillness. Later, in the deep hours, he may wake half confused to the sound of a bell carried through walls and darkness. He may hear movement where he expected none. Footsteps. A distant current of chant. The monastery, which seemed buried in sleep, has risen somewhere beyond him into prayer. And then, just as strangely to him, it quiets again. This difference between guest and monk tells us something essential. A monastery was not merely a collection of buildings that happened to be quiet at night. It was a machine of sacred time. Or perhaps better, a living body governed by ritual hours. To sleep inside its walls was not necessarily to live by its rule. The traveler rested near it. The monk was claimed by it. And so these outer spaces, humble though they may seem, are the right place to pause and to understand the threshold more fully. Here, the world is still close. A guest brings with him the weather of the roads, the rumors of towns, the anxieties of travel, the habits of ordinary life. He may have eaten when hungry, slept when tired, walked when needed, bargained, worried, hurried, cursed the rain, blessed the sight of shelter. He lives by necessity and circumstance. The monk, by contrast, lives by a pattern imposed and repeated until pattern becomes character. This is why the monastery feels different almost as soon as one enters it. Not because it is magically silent, but because its silence is disciplined. Not because it lacks ordinary needs, but because even ordinary needs have their appointed places and times. As the night deepens, the guest house settles. Wood cools. Straw shifts once, twice, then stills. Outside, the air grows colder. The scent of damp earth and old stone seems stronger. Somewhere nearby, perhaps in a service yard or stable, an animal moves softly and then falls quiet again. There is a particular stillness in places built for temporary shelter. It is different from the stillness of a home. different too from the stillness of a dormitory full of men whose lives are synchronized by rule. It is the stillness of pause, of being held for one night between elsewhere and elsewhere. The guest sleeps in that pause, but we move on. For to understand what nights were really like in a medieval monastery, we must now leave the outer zone behind and pass inward, toward the place where the buildings gather around a center, and where night silence becomes more intentional, more complete, and more deeply woven into the life of the house. Ahead of us lies the cloister. By day, the cloister is one of the most characteristic spaces in monastic life. Covered walkways frame an open central garth. Doors lead toward the church, the refectory, the chapter house, perhaps the dormitory stair, perhaps other essential rooms depending on the design of the house. It is a place of movement, of reading, of quiet passage, of formal and informal transition. The monks know it intimately. Their feet mark its paths day after day, year after year. But at night, the cloister changes, or perhaps it is better to say that at night, the cloister reveals a different part of itself. We step into it now, and at once the darkness seems more shaped than before. The open square at the center may hold a little sky above it, perhaps touched with moonlight, perhaps nearly invisible under clouds. The covered walks around it are deeper in shadow. Columns rise and fade, arches appear and disappear depending on the angle of the light. Stone underfoot reflects almost nothing. Each sound becomes distinct. A single footstep here is not loud, yet it carries. The rustle of cloth along the arcade is enough to mark a presence. A slight current of air moves through the passage and touches the skin differently than the open wind outside. It is a contained coolness now, not the wide cold of the road. During the day, the cloister may have felt like the center of movement. At night, it feels like the center of restraint. This is where one begins to understand the great silence. In many monasteries, after the final prayers of the evening, speech was sharply limited. The point was not simply to create atmosphere. Silence was a discipline. It checked distraction. It guarded the tongue. It calmed the community. It marked the passage from the concerns of the day into recollection, rest, and readiness for the night office. To modern ears, silence often suggests privacy, peace, or even awkwardness. In a monastery, it could mean all of those at times, but it also meant obedience. A monk was not free to fill the darkness with his own voice simply because he felt like speaking. And so the night cloister is not just quiet. It is intentionally quiet. Imagine it in the hour after Compline, the last office before sleep. The final responses have been sung. The blessing has been given. The monks have dispersed from the church, not into conversation, but into hush. They move through this cloister in familiar order. Some make for the dormitory. Some complete one last, necessary task. A superior passes. A novice keeps careful pace and careful bearing. No one lingers idly. No one leans against a column to gossip beneath the arcade. The space empties not with chatter fading away, but with silence already in force. That silence does not feel empty. It feels inhabited by habit. Even now, when few are present, the cloister seems full of repeated life. Countless crossings, winter mornings, wet hems in rain, sandaled feet in summer dust, processions on feast days, slow reading in daylight, passing shadows in every season, and night again and again, folding over the same stones. If there is moonlight, perhaps a pale shape rests on one part of the garth, while the rest remains dark. If there is no moon, then the cloister becomes almost entirely a matter of touch, outline, and memory. A monk would not need much light to cross it. He knows where each turn lies. He knows which door opens toward the church, which toward the refectory, which stair leads upward. His body has learned the monastery. That may be one of the most important truths about monastic night. It is not navigated primarily by sight. It is navigated by repetition. The buildings are known not as dramatic scenery, but as lived pathways. And this too changes how the night feels. For us, darkness in a medieval cloister might seem mysterious because we do not know it. For the monk, the same darkness is familiar, though no less demanding for that. He is not exploring. He is returning again and again to places already inscribed in memory. Still, familiarity does not erase the physical reality of the hour. The stone is cold. In winter, very cold. In damp weather, the air clings. A draft slips along the covered walk. The body is tired from the day. The mind is settling or trying to settle. And because speech is gone, smaller sensations come forward. The scrape of a sole, the pressure of night air in the chest, the distant creak of timber, the faint smell of extinguished wax or old mortar. This is the point where many modern imaginations go astray. We often think of silence as soothing because we choose it. But the silence of a medieval monastery at night was part of a demanding life. It could be beautiful, yes. It could also be stern. The monk did not simply enjoy it. He submitted to it, and through submission perhaps came to inhabit it more fully than we can easily imagine. And now, slowly, as the cloister settles around us, we turn toward another room already left behind by the active part of the day. The refectory waits in darkness. There, the evening meal is over. The benches are empty. The bowls and cups have been removed or set in order. The room, which only a short time ago held the gathered community, has fallen still. We will go there next. The refectory by night is one of the clearest reminders that a medieval monastery did not have a separate life of leisure after dark. The day did not end in sociable lingering. It closed. Let us enter the hall slowly and imagine it not at the moment of the meal, but just after. The long tables stand in order. Benches rest where they were drawn back and then returned. The serving vessels are gone, or nearly gone. The room still holds the memory of recent presence, but the presence itself has withdrawn. This is not an abandoned place. It is a finished place, a room whose purpose for the evening has been fulfilled. If the meal was recent enough, perhaps there remains a faint scent of broth, onions, herbs, coarse bread, ale, smoke, or fish, depending on the season, the rule of the house, the day in the liturgical calendar, and the wealth or poverty of the monastery. But the warmth of food does not linger long in a large stone room. Air cools quickly, odors flatten, the hall grows still. Meals in a monastery were not always silent, but they were often governed and restrained. In many houses, reading accompanied eating. A monk might stand at a lectern and read from scripture, a sermon, a saint's life, or another approved text while the others listened and ate. The purpose was not entertainment. Even the meal was folded into discipline. That matters here, because the quiet of the refectory at night is not the quiet that follows a lively gathering. It is the quiet that follows an orderly act. No one has been telling stories across the table. No one has remained behind to laugh with friends. No one lingers with a cup in hand beneath warm light while the hour grows late. That whole pattern of social evening, so natural to many of us, simply does not belong here in the same way. The room has fulfilled its function, and now it returns to darkness. A candle or lamp might still burn briefly, while some necessary task is completed. A brother may move at the edge of the room, collecting what remains to be taken away. There may be the soft scrape of wood against stone, the muted clink of pottery, the folding back of a cloth, the final glance to ensure that all is left in order. Then that too ends. Light is precious. This is one of the most important physical facts to keep in mind whenever we imagine the medieval night. Large interior spaces were not casually illuminated for comfort. Candles cost resources. Oil cost resources. Fire brought danger. A room like this could not simply remain pleasantly lit because someone enjoyed the atmosphere. Once its work was done, darkness reclaimed it. And so the refectory, which by day was communal, practical, and filled with repeated human routine, now becomes almost monumental in its emptiness. A large hall in darkness feels larger than it does in daylight. The roof above fades upward into shadow. Beams may vanish entirely. A wall that seemed ordinary a few hours ago now becomes a blank plane, dimly touched if any light remains at all. The far end of the room is no longer fully visible. Space stretches out and withdraws at the same time. Everything unnecessary disappears. What remains are the essentials: the shape of the tables, the faint smell of the meal, the stored coolness of stone, and the sense that the community has passed through here together and moved on as one. This is what gives a monastery at night its particular character. The buildings do not merely become quiet one by one. They fall in line with the hours. Their use is not random. Their silence is scheduled. Each room has had its time, and when that time is over, it yields itself back to stillness. For the monks, this would not feel poetic in the way it may sound to us. It would feel normal, familiar, repeated so many times that the body scarcely questions it. Eat, listen, rise, leave, keep silence, sleep when told, rise when called. That steady pattern is the true architecture of the monastic night, more even than the stone walls themselves. And yet, because we are walking slowly through this world, we can linger a little longer in the darkened hall and notice details the monks themselves may scarcely have thought about. Perhaps a draft moves through the room from a poorly sealed door. Perhaps one board in a table gives a tiny sound as the wood settles in the cooling air. Perhaps a trace of rushes lies along the floor, carrying the mixed scent of feet, food, wax, and old straw. Perhaps the lectern from which the reading was given still stands where it was used, its presence a reminder that even nourishment was accompanied by words intended to shape the soul. Then, after a few moments, the room becomes too still to hold us. We leave it behind and turn toward the practical heart of the monastery. The place is less often remembered in romantic images of monastic life, but absolutely essential to understanding what night was really like. For a monastery was not only a house of prayer, it was also a working community. Somewhere nearby are service rooms, kitchen spaces, storage areas, workshops perhaps, and in some monasteries a warming room, one of the very few places where heat might be available in a more regular and welcome way. These rooms remind us that no matter how spiritual the aims of the house, bodies still needed food, fires needed tending, tools needed storing, and buildings needed watching. The kitchen at this hour is not busy, but it is not entirely without life. A medieval kitchen does not simply switch off as ours does. Fire must be managed. Ash must be understood. Embers may be banked carefully so that heat can be preserved and rekindled. Water may still stand in buckets or tubs. Utensils have to be cleaned, stacked, hung, or set aside. The final tasks of the day are practical and exact. There is a distinct atmosphere to a kitchen after its labor is done. The stronger heat is fading now, but traces of it remain near the hearth. The smell of soot clings to the air, mixed with the sense of cooked food, damp wood, and iron. Ash lies pale where flames burned brighter earlier. The last glow in the fire has become modest and inward. Instead of lively flames leaping upward, there are red pockets of heat buried low, breathing quietly under darkening fuel. This is a humble sight, but an important one. A banked fire is one of the best images for the monastery at night. Outwardly dim, inwardly alive, resting, but not extinguished. The practical concern here is obvious. Fire is useful, precious, and dangerous. A monastery built partly or wholly of timber in key areas, furnished with wood, cloth, straw, books, and stores of everyday materials, could not treat open flame carelessly. Night sharpened that danger, so part of the nightly routine was not just to cease activity, but to secure the conditions of safety. A monk, servant, lay brother, or assigned worker moving through these final tasks would not likely regard them as separate from the religious life of the house. In the monastery, labor too had its place under obedience. To bank the fire properly, to leave vessels in order, to close what should be closed, to guard against waste or accident, all of that belonged to the same world of rule and responsibility as prayer itself. That does not mean such tasks were always done joyfully. Medieval people were not less human than we are. They grew tired, distracted, sore, impatient, chilled, and sleepy. But the ideal remained. Each act had its time and purpose. And now, as the kitchen quiets, perhaps we pass a doorway or chamber that leads to the warming room. Not every monastery had one in the same form, and not every period treated heated space in the same way, but the very idea matters. Most monastic buildings were cold more often than modern people easily imagine. Stone preserved chill, openings admitted drafts, winters could be harsh, hands numbed, feet froze, breath showed in the air. In such a world, even a modest heated room had significance. The warming room is not a lounge. It is not a place of indulgent relaxation. It is simply one of the few points in the monastic complex where the body might briefly recover some comfort from the season's severity. At night, even here, the use would be limited. Perhaps the heat is already lower now. Perhaps no one remains. Perhaps the benches, if there are benches, sit empty beside a guarded source of warmth. Perhaps the last monk to pass through has already gone, carrying a little restored feeling in his hands and face, back into the colder spaces beyond. For many listeners today, this may be the moment when the physical life of the monastery becomes most real. We can admire arches and chant and ancient routine from a distance, but cold enters the imagination quickly. To rise from bed into an unheated building, to cross stone floors in winter, to stand in church while the body longs for sleep and warmth, to measure comfort not by abundance, but by the rare existence of a room slightly less cold than the rest. This is part of the truth of monastic night. The life was disciplined not only in spirit, but in the body. Now the service rooms too begin to fall entirely silent. The kitchen gives off only a little residual heat. The utensils are at rest. The embers sink lower. Somewhere a door is secured. Somewhere footsteps retreat. And overhead or beyond, the monks are making their way toward the place where the first portion of night's rest will begin. We follow them now, leaving behind the last practical warmth of the day. Ahead lies the stair to the dormitory. This is a quieter transition than the gatehouse, quieter even than the cloister, because it is no longer the movement from world to enclosure or from labor to silence. It is the movement from wakefulness to sleep. The stair itself may be stone, worn slightly at the center by years of passing feet. It may rise directly from the cloister or connect efficiently with the church, depending on the plan of the monastery. Medieval monastic architecture was often shaped by routine. Roots mattered, proximity mattered. To place the dormitory in relation to the church was not accidental. The body had to be able to move from one state to another, from sleep to prayer, with as little confusion and delay as possible. We place a hand against the wall as we rise. The stone is cool. The air seems thinner here, quieter, held. Below us, the practical rooms of supper and fire are receding. Ahead of us waits the long sleeping chamber where privacy is slight, obedience continues, and the body is allowed its rest, though not for the whole night. At the foot of such a stair, a modern visitor might expect relief. At last, bed. For the monks, there is relief in it, no doubt. They are tired. The day has been long. Their limbs ache in small, ordinary ways. Their minds are settling. But the dormitory is not simply a refuge of comfort. It is another shared space under rule. We climb a little further. Each step feels like entering a deeper level of quiet. No meal waits above, no conversation, no firelit gathering. Only the slow surrender of a community to sleep, each man in his place, knowing that the bell will come. At the top, the dormitory opens before us. We will enter it next. The dormitory is one of the most revealing places in the entire monastery, because here the ideals of the monastic life meet the simple, unavoidable facts of the human body. By the time we enter, the hour is late. The last movements of the evening have nearly ceased. The great silence lies over the house. The practical tasks below are done. The refectory is dark. The cloister has emptied. The church waits in shadow for the hour when it will once again fill with chant. And here, in this long sleeping chamber, the monks lie down together, not as separate householders, not as men arranging their own evenings according to preference, but as members of a disciplined community whose rest is part of the rule. In many monasteries, especially in earlier centuries, the dormitory was a shared hall. That fact alone changes the entire feeling of night. We are used to sleep as something private, a room of one's own, a lamp one may switch off at will, a mattress chosen for comfort, the possibility of reading, speaking, turning, rising, or lying awake without that act belonging to a larger communal order. The medieval monastic dormitory offered very little of that. Sleep here was collective, arranged, supervised at least in principle, and folded into obedience. The room itself may be long and high, with a timber roof overhead or stone supporting structures depending on the house. Openings may be few. The night air finds its way in nevertheless. In winter, the cold gathers in the room and settles into everything. In damp weather, the bedding may seem to hold the season in its fibers. Even in milder times of year, there is a plainness to the space that reminds us that comfort is not the point. Beds or sleeping places are arranged in order. In some periods and places, these may be simple individual spaces in a common hall. In others, later partitions or cubicles may provide some separation without creating full privacy. But whether the monks sleep in closer openness or in modestly divided compartments, the principle remains the same. This is communal rest. The body is allowed sleep, but not self-indulgence. The night is granted, but not owned. Let us pause and look slowly around the room. Blankets are rougher than anything most modern listeners would willingly choose. Mattresses, if we may call them that, are simple, perhaps stuffed with straw wool, or other available materials. Pillows are modest or absent. Personal possessions are few. Clothing is either worn, kept near at hand, or arranged in such a way that rising quickly in the dark will not become disorderly confusion. This matters because the monks are not preparing for a full, uninterrupted descent into private sleep. They are preparing for the first sleep. That old rhythm, more familiar to many earlier societies than to ours, is especially important here. The night is divided. Rest is real and often deeply needed, but it is not final. The body will sink into sleep and later be summoned out of it. Before that interruption comes, however, there is this moment, the room settling. One by one, the last small sounds of readiness disappear. A garment shifts, a blanket is drawn higher, a body lowers itself carefully or with tired familiarity. Sandals are placed aside. Someone clears his throat once, softly. Someone turns to ease an ache in shoulder or hip. A novice, newer to the rhythm than the others, may still carry a trace of awkwardness in his movements. An older monk may lower himself more slowly than he did years before. Another may already be half asleep as soon as he lies down. Then the room begins to breathe as one. That is perhaps the strangest and most intimate fact of communal sleep, the shared sound of breathing in darkness. It is never perfectly uniform. One man breathes deeply, another lightly. One shifts and settles, another grows still at once. Somewhere there is the faint rustle of straw. Somewhere the quiet tap of wood as a bed frame accepts weight and then stills. From farther away, perhaps near a shutter or opening, a thread of wind enters and moves almost invisibly across the room. No one speaks. Or if any necessary word is spoken, it is brief and low and gone at once. The great silence has followed them here. To modern ears, this might sound peaceful, and often it probably was in its way. But it would be a mistake to imagine the dormitory only as a scene of calm beauty. It is also a place of fatigue, discipline, discomfort, and ordinary bodily need. Men snore. Men wake with cramps. Men sleep lightly or heavily. Men age. Men fall ill. Men grow accustomed to cold without ever exactly enjoying it. The ideal of monastic order does not erase the fact that a dormitory is full of actual bodies. That, too, is part of what nights were really like. There may be a monk here whose hands are sore from labor done earlier in the day. Another whose knees trouble him when the weather turns. Another who, though devout and obedient, still dreads the bell in winter. Another who has lived this rhythm so long that his body seems to anticipate the waking before it happens. A novice may still feel the strangeness of sleeping in a room full of others, under rule, under silence, in a life no longer organized around family or village or ordinary household custom. An older brother may remember many years of such nights, each one unremarkable in itself, yet together forming the greater part of a lifetime. This is one of the deepest truths of the monastery. Its power does not come from constant intensity. It comes from repetition. The same stair, the same hall, the same office, the same bed, the same bell sounding into the dark over and over until the pattern enters the muscles, the memory, the soul. And so the dormitory at night is not dramatic. It is formative. If we stay here a little longer, we begin to notice how darkness changes the sense of the room. By day, one would see the arrangement clearly. At night, distance becomes uncertain. The far end of the dormitory recedes. The ceiling loses its detail. The line between one sleeping place and the next matters less to the eye than to memory. Perhaps there is a lamp somewhere, very low, perhaps not. More likely, The room is left to darkness almost entirely, because darkness itself is part of the discipline, and light is not wasted. In winter, the cold may become the strongest presence of all. It enters through stone, through air, through the very fact of the season. Blankets help, but only so much. Hands tucked beneath rough covers slowly warm. Noses and cheeks may remain chilled. To rise later from whatever warmth has been gathered in the bed will require a small act of will. In such conditions, the first sleep can feel precious indeed. And perhaps this is why the dormitory deserves such attention in our walk. We often think of monastic life in terms of the visible sacred moments: the church, the chanting, the candlelight, the solemn offices. Those moments mattered greatly, but they rested on a foundation of bodily discipline. The monk who sings at Matins is the same man who has slept cold, risen tired, dressed in darkness, walked worn stone, and stood when he would have preferred to remain beneath his blanket. The spiritual life here is not detached from the body. It is carried by it, tested through it, and shaped against its reluctance. Now the room is stiller than before. Breathing deepens. Movements have become rare. The house appears at rest. If we were only passing through, if we knew nothing of the rhythm that governs the monastery, we might think this is the end of the night's story. The monks have gone to bed. Silence has fallen. The buildings sleep. But the monastery does not sleep in the same way the world outside sleeps. That is what makes its nights so distinctive. Beyond these walls, villagers sleep until dawn unless weather, work, fear, sickness, or misfortune wakes them. Travelers sleep when they can. Lords and servants, merchants and laborers, families in cottages and houses and manors all have their own rhythms, but most are still organized by ordinary human need. Sleep when tired, rise when morning comes, wake if something disturbs you. Here, disturbance is built into devotion. The interruption is intentional. The monks know this as they lie down, whether consciously in each moment or simply in the deep knowledge of habit. Sleep is coming, yes, but so too is the bell. This changes the entire emotional texture of rest. It gives the night a kind of suspended quality. The bed is welcome, but not final. The silence is deep, but not permanent. Even the darkness feels as though it is waiting. And so the first sleep settles over the dormitory like a tide. It covers the room gradually. One by one, the last waking thoughts loosen their hold. The aches of the day recede. The shared chamber, so recently full of small adjustments and tired awareness, becomes a place of near complete stillness. Outside, the wind may move along the walls. Somewhere below, timber quietly contracts in the cooling air. Perhaps rain touches the roof. Perhaps frost gathers outside under a clear sky. Perhaps clouds pass unseen. The night continues over the monastery, indifferent to human order, even as human order prepares to answer it with prayer. Then, at the darkest hour, or one of the darkest, the bell comes. It does not ask. It breaks into the room with the authority of rule, habit, and sacred time. Whether struck from the church tower, rung by hand nearby, or sounded according to the custom of the house, it enters sleep as something expected and still unwelcome in the bodily sense. A bell heard while fully awake can sound solemn, beautiful, even reassuring. A bell heard from deep sleep in a cold dormitory is something else. It is command. The first note cuts the dark, then another, and another. The dormitory stirs. A blanket is thrown back. Someone inhales sharply. Someone else is already moving, practiced by years. A novice wakes in confusion for half a heartbeat before memory returns. An old monk opens his eyes to the same duty he has met 1,000 times. The room, moments before so still, fills with the sounds of reluctant but orderly life returning. This is the center of the monastic night. Not endless midnight chanting, not eerie wandering through corridors, but this exact transition from sleep to obedience. Men rise in darkness because the hour of prayer has come. Their limbs are heavy. The air is cold. Their minds may still be clouded with sleep. None of that removes the obligation. Indeed, in a way, it gives the obligation its meaning. To rise when one would rather remain, to wake when the body resists, to bring oneself, not later but now, toward the church. This is vigilance made physical. The bell continues, or its echo lingers. Feet meet the floor. Wool shifts in the dark. Hands find garments by memory. No bright light floods the room. The waking is not meant to imitate day. It is still night, profoundly night, and the monks move within that fact rather than trying to abolish it. A few may cross themselves. Some may be fully alert sooner than others. No doubt a few inwardly groan, though discipline teaches the face and body another lesson. And then, quietly, the room begins to empty. Not in disorder, not in haste exactly, but in a practiced stream. This next movement, from dormitory to church, is one of the most beautiful and revealing in the whole monastic rhythm, because it shows how architecture, habit, and devotion all join together in the dark. We follow them now, out of the sleeping chamber and toward the night office. The passage from the dormitory to the church is one of those movements that, once imagined properly, stays in the mind. It is quiet, repeated, unadorned, and yet full of meaning. Only a short while ago, the monks lay in shared darkness, gathered into the heavy stillness of the first sleep. Now they move through the monastery again, not because the night has ended, but because the rule of the house has called them awake before dawn. This is not an emergency, not a disturbance in the ordinary sense. It is the ordinary sense within these walls. The interruption belongs to the design of life itself. We leave the dormitory with them. The air outside the sleeping chamber feels colder than the air beneath the blankets, even if the dormitory itself was far from warm. That first contact with the night beyond the bed would have been one of the hardest parts of the whole experience. The body, drawn too quickly from sleep, notices cold with unusual sharpness. Hands that had been tucked into rough warmth now meet chill fabric, chill stone, chill air. Eyes are open, but the mind has not entirely caught up. Thought moves slowly. Memory and habit do most of the work, and in a monastery, habit is powerful. A monk who has walked this route many hundreds of times does not need to study it each night. His body knows the turns. The feet know where the stair narrows slightly, where the passage bends, where the threshold rises a little under the sole, where a hand may briefly brush the wall for balance. The building has become part of memory, and memory part of obedience. That is why the darkness here is not the darkness of confusion, though it may still feel severe. It is a known darkness. The stair or corridor leading toward the church is shaped by function as much as by stone. In many monasteries, the dormitory was placed so that the monks could go directly or nearly directly to the church for the night office. This was practical, but more than practical. It made possible the rhythm the house required: rest, rising, gathering, prayer. Architecture here is not separate from spiritual life. It is one of the tools by which that life is made regular. And so, the procession begins. Not a grand procession with candles blazing and incense rising, not on an ordinary night. This is smaller, dimmer, more intimate. The sound is mostly the sound of feet, cloth, breathing, and the fading authority of the bell. Wool habits brush softly as the monks move, sandals meet worn stone. A sleeve shifts, a door opens and closes with restrained care. In winter, breath may be visible in faint clouds wherever a little light catches it. In wetter seasons, the air may feel heavy and close. In summer, the chill may be less biting, though the body, recently woken, still resents it. No one speaks unless necessity absolutely requires it. The great silence, though interrupted by movement, still governs the hour. This gives the passage its special quality. It is full of living presence, but almost empty of voice. The men are awake, yet not fully social. They are together, yet turned toward a shared purpose greater than conversation. The night still surrounds them, and they move through it as a disciplined body. There is something humbling in this image. Modern life encourages us to think of wakefulness as personal. We choose when to go to bed, when to wake, whether to rise at once or lie there a while, whether to switch on a lamp, whether to speak, whether to make tea, whether to answer the call of the day. In the monastery, at least in the ideal, those private negotiations had been yielded to the rule. The bell decides, the route is known, the purpose is fixed, one rises, dresses as needed, and goes. This is what gives the monastic night its austere dignity. It does not flatter comfort. It does not wait upon mood. It asks the body to obey before the body is ready. The passage itself may open briefly toward the cloister, or run above it, or connect by a stair and entry that leads efficiently into the church. We need not tie ourselves too tightly to one exact floor plan, because monasteries varied, but the principle remains clear. The route is close, deliberate, and repeated until it becomes part of the monk's inward landscape. As we move with them, we begin to notice again how little medieval night depended on abundant light. Perhaps a small lamp burns somewhere ahead. Perhaps one monk carries a dim light sufficient only to prevent confusion at thresholds and steps. Or perhaps the route is made almost entirely by memory, by the faintest available light from an opening, by moon through an arcade, by the body's long familiarity with place. Darkness is not banished. It is managed. This affects the emotional world of the walk more than any modern reconstruction can fully capture. A corridor lit by electric fixtures is never truly a night corridor. A stair made safe by bright bulbs cannot reproduce the medieval sense of partial perception. Here, a doorframe is not fully seen until one is near it. A face may be only a paler shape in shadow. Stone seems to emerge from darkness rather than stand fully before the eye. The architecture is not displayed. It is encountered. And because it is encountered this way, the church ahead takes on unusual force. During the day, the church is always central, but it belongs to the visible fabric of the monastery. At this hour, it becomes something more concentrated. It is the destination of unwilling bodies and willing souls, of practiced feet and sleepy minds, of habit, duty, and devotion all moving toward one liturgical center. The entire house, briefly awakened out of its rest, aims itself here. We reach the threshold. The change is immediate. Even if the church is only dimly lit, it feels different from the passage outside. Interior space opens, sound shifts. The smallest movement is received differently beneath a high roof. A lamp before an altar, a few candles in the choir, or whatever modest light the customs of the house allow, begin to define the space in islands and plains. Darkness still governs much of the building, but now it is joined by points of sacred visibility. This is the heart of the monastic night. We enter slowly. The church at Matins on an ordinary night is not dazzling. It is not staged for spectacle. It is solemn because it is used, because it is known, because it receives the community at one of the hardest and most disciplined hours of the whole day. That is what gives it power. The monks take their places in the choir. Here again, order matters. Each man has his place, his role within the greater rhythm of psalm, reading, response, and chant. The arrangement of stalls, benches, lecterns, and liturgical space is not accidental. It supports the office, the repeated prayer that structures time itself within the house. The last traces of bodily clumsiness settle. A sleeve is adjusted. A foot finds its familiar place. A hand rests on wood worn smooth by years of use. And then, after the movement, stillness. The church is now the one place in the monastery fully awake. Outside, night remains deep. The outer road is dark. The guest house is at rest. The refectory is empty. The dormitory, though recently stirred, has been left behind. But here, in the choir, voices are about to rise. Not loudly, not theatrically, but steadily, into the darkness before dawn. Matins begins. For many listeners today, the word itself may seem remote, but the experience it names is central to monastic life. This is the great night office, or one of the most important night offices depending on period and custom, made up of psalms, readings, responses, and chant. It can be lengthy. It can be demanding. On feast days, it can become more elaborate still. But even on an ordinary night, it carries a special weight because of when it happens. The monks are not praying at a convenient hour. They are praying out of sleep. That fact changes everything. The first chant begins, and sound moves through the church differently than it would by day. Darkness heightens hearing. When the eye sees less, the ear receives more. The stone returns the voices with a softened firmness. Wood and vaulting shape the tone. A single line of chant may seem at once near and far, intimate and architectural. The church, so silent moments before, becomes resonant. This is perhaps the scene most people half imagine when they think of a monastery at night, and for once the imagination is not entirely wrong. There really is chant in darkness. There really are candles. There really are men standing in choir while the rest of the world sleeps. But the modern imagination often leaves out the fatigue, the cold, the length, the familiarity of the texts, the effort required to be present in body and mind at such an hour. That missing effort matters, because without it, the scene becomes decorative, and monastic night was not decorative. It was work, prayerful work, and sometimes simply work in the plainest sense of endurance. The psalms continue. A reading follows, then a response, then another psalm. The rhythm is not hurried. It unfolds according to long habit and inherited order. For the monks, these words are not fresh each night in the way a new speech or story would be fresh. They are repeated, known, learned by ear and memory, lived through again and again until the office forms a kind of interior climate. That repetition can deepen devotion. It can also test attention. Anyone who has ever tried to remain mentally present through familiar words while tired can understand the challenge. And yet, this is exactly the point. To pray here, in darkness, against heaviness of body and mind, is to practice watchfulness. Not the dramatic watchfulness of alarm, but the slow, disciplined watchfulness of fidelity. Stay awake, stand, sing, Listen, answer, continue. Let the night become prayer rather than mere unconsciousness. This is one reason medieval monastic writers and traditions placed such value on night offices. They were not simply another set of prayers among many. They dramatized in physical form the struggle to remain spiritually awake. The world sleeps. The monk rises. The body longs for bed. The rule calls him to choir. The darkness outside is real. So too is the darkness of forgetfulness, sloth, distraction, temptation, and inward drift. To answer the bell is to resist those things, however imperfectly. Of course, real monks were not symbols. They were men. Some would have felt devotion keenly in these hours. Some would have felt mostly numbness and cold. Some would have moved between the two from one night to the next. An elderly monk with aching joints may have leaned more heavily on his stall than he once did. A novice may have fought sleep with all his strength. A monk accustomed to years of this rhythm may have entered the chant with a steadier discipline, even if not always with a warmer heart. The office makes room for all of them because it does not depend on constant inward intensity. It depends on fidelity to the form. That is one of the great secrets of monastic life. It is not built on feeling one's best. It is built on returning. As the office continues, the church itself seems to change shape under the conditions of night. A candle near the altar throws a limited field of light that does not dissolve the darkness around it. The stalls of the choir may be visible in some detail, then vanish a little as the eye lifts upward. Columns rise into shadow. Side aisles fade. The roof overhead may seem immeasurably high because so much of it cannot be clearly seen. A hanging lamp marks one point. A lectern marks another. Beyond them, much remains hidden. This selective visibility gives the church a peculiar intimacy. In daylight, architecture declares itself. At night, it withdraws. The building is still present in all its mass and form, yet only parts of it reveal themselves at any given moment. A carved edge, a glint of metalwork, the pale face or hand of a monk turning slightly in candlelight. The rest is held back. That partial concealment makes the chant feel even more central. The church is less something looked at than something heard and inhabited. On an ordinary night, this has a plain and powerful beauty. On a feast night, it might become magnificent. Then there would be more light, more ceremonial richness, perhaps fuller use of incense, a stronger sense of solemn celebration breaking into the dark. Christmas, Easter, the feast of a major saint, such nights could transform the church into a brighter and more emotionally heightened place. Those nights lingered in memory precisely because they rose above the baseline of routine. But most nights were not feast nights. Most nights were ordinary nights. And that is where the real truth lies. An ordinary night office meant familiar psalms, tired bodies, modest light, cold air, and a long obedience carried out, not for novelty, but because this is what the life required. If we want to know what nights were really like in a medieval monastery, we must not only imagine the rare splendor, we must imagine the 100 plain nights that made splendor meaningful when it came. The chant goes on. The words rise and fall. Time behaves differently in such a setting. Outside the monastery, night is often measured by sleep and darkness alone. Here, it is measured by sequence. Psalm follows psalm. Reading follows reading. The office gives shape to hours that would otherwise be undifferentiated. The monks are not merely awake at night. They are articulating night, dividing it, sanctifying it, enduring it in common. This is why one may fairly say that the monastery did not simply inhabit time. In a certain sense, it made time audible. Bells marked it. Offices filled it. Architecture supported it. Bodies suffered and submitted to it. And in the center of all this, the church at Matins became the place where the whole ideal of the monastic night took form. When you picture it rightly, the scene is neither sentimental nor grim. It is human. There is beauty in the chant, yes. There is also stiffness in the legs. There is dignity in the silence between responses. There is also the private effort not to lose focus. There is sanctity in the office. There is also repetition, fatigue, routine, and the weather entering the bones. All these belong together, and perhaps that is what makes the image endure. Not because it shows monks as somehow beyond ordinary human limits, but because it shows human limits taken up into a disciplined act of worship. The office does not abolish tiredness, it transfigures it, or at least attempts to. The church remains awake while the world sleeps. That single fact, more than any romantic ornament, captures the reality of the monastery at night. Soon we will look more closely at the dim edges of this interior world, at the side spaces and partial lights that surround the choir. But for now, we remain a moment longer in the sound of matins, in the long breathing rhythm of chant and response, in the glow that reaches only so far, in the darkness beyond it, and in the deep, repeated labor of prayer before dawn. Beyond the choir, beyond the immediate circle of stalls, lecterns, and candlelight, the church continues into shadow. This is where the night reveals another of its truths. A medieval church after dark is never fully seen all at once. In daylight, the eye can travel freely. It can take in the line of the columns, the sweep of arches, the shape of the nave, the carving on capitals, the pattern of paving, the side chapels, shrines, screens, lamps, altars, and all the smaller features that together give the building its visible order. But at night, especially on an ordinary night, so much of that withdraws. The church becomes a world of partial revelation. A candle burns, and for a few feet around it, stone takes on form and color. A polished surface catches a brief glint. The edge of a carved screen emerges from darkness. A pillar stands pale on one side and disappears on the other. The floor reflects almost nothing. The farther spaces do not vanish entirely, but they recede into a quiet that seems nearly physical, as if the darkness itself were part of the architecture. This matters because it changes how prayer is experienced. In such conditions, the mind is not invited to wander over visual abundance. It stays close to what is near. A flame, a page, a voice, a familiar outline. The church is not less present for being less visible. In some ways, it is more present, because what can be seen feels chosen out of a larger, hidden whole. Let us imagine, for a moment, the side chapels. Perhaps there is a small altar set into the wall of a side aisle. Perhaps a painted image or carved figure rests above it, now only half visible. Perhaps a lamp burns before a relic shrine, its glow no brighter than a patient ember. The shrine itself may hold metalwork, crystal, enamel, or polished surfaces that answer the candlelight with tiny flashes. But the eye cannot dwell on them long, because most of the object remains obscure. What is seen is enough to suggest richness without displaying it completely. This is one of the reasons medieval religious interiors must have felt so different at night than they do in modern museums, guidebooks, or electrified restorations. We are used to seeing everything. The medieval night allowed only enough light for reverence, function, and orientation. The rest remained hidden, not by intention alone, but by the simple limits of firelight. And hidden things affect the imagination. Not necessarily with fear, though fear was not unknown to medieval people, but with a sense that the visible world is never the whole of what surrounds us. A shrine half seen in darkness can feel more solemn than the same shrine fully lit. A saint's face glimpsed in low flame can seem more inward, more withdrawn into silence than the same face under noon light. The church at night does not argue. It suggests. For the monks, who knew the building well, these side spaces were not mysterious in the way they might be for us. Yet their nighttime presence still mattered. They formed the margins of the office, the dim beyond of the immediate liturgical action. While the choir prayed, the rest of the church did not cease to exist. It stood around them, larger than the pool of light, filled with memories of other hours, other rites, other processions, burials, private devotions, feast day splendors, daylight masses, and countless repetitions of ordinary prayer. Night gathers all of that into stillness. A church used every day and every season does not become empty simply because few parts of it are lit. On the contrary, its darkness feels inhabited by accumulated life. The monks may not be looking toward the side altars or the farther reaches of the nave, but those places remain silently present, just beyond full sight, as part of the same sacred enclosure. This selective world of light also has a practical effect on the body. When one is tired, the eyes do not search as actively. They rest where the light allows them to rest. A candle becomes a point of steadiness. The carved edge of a stall, worn by generations of hands, becomes a small certainty beneath the fingers. The page of a book, if it is being read by the available light, asks for effort. The church at night narrows attention. It does not permit the easy visual freedom of day. That narrowing, too, is part of the discipline. So much of monastic life involves accepting limits of speech, of comfort, of movement, of diet, of sleep, of personal preference, of self-display. Firelight imposes another limit. It says, in effect, this is enough for now. Enough to pray, enough to stand, enough to hear, enough to continue. Beyond that lies shadow. Perhaps somewhere in the darkness hangs a lamp before the reserved sacrament or before an altar of particular importance. Perhaps somewhere a metal fitting catches a passing flicker and then is gone again. Perhaps a painted wall seems almost alive for a moment when flame stirs, then flattens back into obscurity. None of this would have been theatrical in the modern sense. It would simply have been the ordinary visual world of medieval night, and ordinary visual worlds shape ordinary thought. A person who lives for years in spaces only partly lit after dark learns a different relation to visibility, to uncertainty, to what is known by memory rather than constant sight. The monk in choir does not need to inspect the whole church. He belongs within it. The unseen portions are not absent. They are trusted. That trust is worth lingering over. Modern people often experience darkness as deprivation because we are accustomed to constant illumination. The medieval monk, though surely no lover of discomfort for its own sake, lived in a world where darkness was normal and visibility partial. The side chapel in shadow, the shrine known more by habit than by clear sight, the long aisle fading into obscurity, these were not failures of perception. They were part of reality, as usually experienced. And so, in the midst of Matins, with chant moving through the choir and candlelight touching only selected places, the church offers a lesson not only in prayer, but in proportion. Not everything is displayed. Not everything needs to be. the office continues in a world where much remains beyond the eye. Eventually, our attention turns from these dim and solemn margins to another part of the monastery altogether, one quieter still, and marked not by liturgical order, but by human weakness. Not every monk can endure every night in the same way. Some are old, some are ill, some are recovering from injury or fever. Some cannot stand long in the cold without cost. The ideal of monastic discipline was strong, but it was never lived by angels. It was lived by bodies that failed, aged, ached, and sometimes simply could not keep pace. And so there is another night within the monastery night, the night of the infirmary. If we leave the church now, or imagine another part of the complex while the office continues, we come to a place gentler in some ways, though not necessarily more comfortable by modern standards. The infirmary exists because the monastic life, however strict in principle, had to reckon with frailty. A sick monk might be excused from the full office. An elderly brother might be given some concession. Care had to be offered. Food might differ here. Heat might be kept more carefully if possible. The pace of the room would not be the pace of the choir. This is an important correction to any overly rigid image of monastery life. The rule gave shape. Reality required mercy. Let us imagine the infirmary at night. The light here, if there is light, is soft and few-pointed, not because the room is sentimental, but because wakefulness is practical. A monk lies resting under rough covers. Another shifts in feverish sleep. A brother assigned to care for the sick may move quietly from bed to bed, checking a bowl, a cloth, a cup of water, a blanket tucked more securely against the cold. The sounds are small, breathing, a low cough, the creak of a board, the faint stirring of straw. Perhaps from farther away, through wall or passage, the distant cadence of Matins can just barely be heard, enough to remind those here that the community's prayer continues, even when they cannot fully join it. There is tenderness in this image, and it belongs fully within the truth of monastic night. A monastery was disciplined, yes. It could be harsh. It expected much. But it was also a community of mutual obligation. To tend a sick brother in the dark, to keep watch beside him, to make room in the ideal pattern for his weakness, this too was part of the life. And weakness was no rare exception. Every monastery contained old men who had once risen more swiftly than they now could. It contained novices discovering that zeal is easier in daylight than in the middle of a winter night. It contained men whose stomachs troubled them, whose joints inflamed, whose lungs weakened, whose eyesight dimmed, whose sleep grew thinner with age. The night makes all of this more visible, even when the room itself is dim. Day can hide fragility behind activity. Night exposes how dependent human beings remain on warmth, care, rhythm, and the patience of others. A monk in the infirmary hearing the bell may feel two things at once: relief that he is excused, sorrow or frustration that he cannot stand in choir, or perhaps simple exhaustion beyond either feeling. A caregiver may hear the distant chant and know his own prayer, for this night at least, is to remain where suffering is. The ideal unity of the house is not broken by such differences. It is tested and expressed through them. This is why the infirmary deserves its place in our walk. Without it, monastery night would seem all rule and no mercy, all order and no allowance for the truth of the body. With it, the picture becomes more human. The same life that asks men to rise from sleep also teaches them to tend the weak. The same house that values vigilance also learns, at least in its better moments, that compassion has its own form of vigilance. The room itself may be plainer than we would wish, but even plainness can hold care. A cup set within reach, a blanket adjusted, a basin prepared, a small flame watched, a whispered prayer spoken where formal office cannot be kept in full, and outside, or not far away, the greater monastery continues its rhythm. The church resounds gently with familiar words. The cloister lies dark. The dormitory is half empty. The kitchen embers sink lower. The gate remains shut against the night road. Yet here in the infirmary, time moves at another pace, measured not by the turn of psalms, but by breath, fever, discomfort, waiting, and the quiet attentiveness of one person to another. There is no better reminder that medieval monastic life, for all its architecture and liturgy and rule, was still human life. And human life, especially at night, is fragile. From here, our walk moves outward once more, away from the bedside and beyond the living quarters, toward one of the calmest and most reflective places in the whole enclosure, the burial ground. The cemetery of the monks at night is not a place of horror. It is a place of continuity. By day, it may be crossed without much pause by those accustomed to its presence. Graves become part of the ordinary topography of the house. A path runs near them. Grass grows around them. Names are remembered or forgotten according to custom, memory, and time. But at night, especially under a clear sky, the burial ground becomes newly visible in the mind, even when little of it is clearly seen by the eye. Let us step there slowly. The air feels open again after the enclosed spaces of dormitory, church, and infirmary. If the sky is clear, stars may stand above the monastery with a steadiness that no candle can imitate. If clouds cover them, then the darkness is softer and lower. The grass is damp with dew, or edged with frost, or stirred lightly by wind. Stones or wooden markers rise from the ground in humble shapes. Nothing here is meant to astonish. Everything is meant to remind. The monks who now sleep, wake, pray, or keep watch among the sick have walked past the resting places of earlier brothers many times. Men who once rose at the same bell, crossed the same cloister, sang the same office, endured the same cold, and lay down in the same dormitory are now beneath the ground. The monastery contains its own past not only in walls and customs, but in bodies returned to earth. Night deepens that awareness. In darkness, the burial ground no longer appears as a managed plot of land alone. It becomes a field of memory, however incomplete that memory may be. A monk standing here, or even merely passing nearby, would need no ghostly imagination to feel the force of mortality. It was part of the life, part of the teaching. Remember that you will die. Pray for the dead. Join your small routine to the longer continuity of those who kept it before you and those who will keep it after you for a time, before joining you in the same earth. This is not morbid, it is steadying. The cemetery at night says to the monastery that all this repetition matters not because it leads to earthly distinction, but because it forms souls under the shadow of death. The same bell that wakes the living once tolled for the dead. The same church that receives night chant receives burial rites. The same community that gathers in choir also commits its brothers to the ground and goes on singing. And in this sense, the monastery's nighttime routine takes on a larger depth. To rise in darkness, to pray while tired, to keep silence, to endure cold, to walk familiar paths, all of it belongs to a life lived with death not hidden away, but accepted as a constant horizon. The burial ground is quiet, but not empty. It joins the living night to all the nights that have come before. We remain there only a little while. The grass is wet. The air is cool. The stars, if they are visible, seem far beyond the reach of any monastery wall. And still, within those walls, the ordered life goes on. And because the ordered life goes on, the night inside a monastery is never experienced in exactly the same way in every season. The route we have walked remains largely the same. The gate still closes. The cloister still falls silent. The dormitory still receives the first sleep. The bell still breaks the dark. The church still gathers the monks before dawn. And yet winter, spring, summer, and autumn each lay a different hand upon these same stones. This is worth lingering over, because the medieval monastery was not protected from the year by central heating, electric light, sealed windows, or the 1,000 quiet technologies that now soften the edges of season for us. The monks did not merely observe the weather, they lived inside it. Their night routine was shaped not only by rule and architecture, but by cold, damp, wind, thaw, mist, frost, and the slow turning of the agricultural year outside the walls. Let us begin with winter. Winter is perhaps the season most people instinctively associate with the medieval monastery, and not without reason. The image of stone buildings, deep darkness, and monks rising from rough beds into a freezing church has a powerful hold on the imagination because it contains a great deal of truth. In winter, the night feels longer even before it begins. The daylight fades early. The cold gathers before sunset and strengthens after it. By the time the evening office is finished and the monastery settles into silence, the darkness outside the walls has become thick and complete. The road we approached at the beginning of our walk would now be hard under frost, or heavy with mud, or locked in frozen ruts. Bare branches show black against the sky. The smell of smoke from village hearths carries farther in the clear, cold air. Inside the monastery, winter enters every room. The refectory sheds its warmth quickly after the meal. The cloister turns severe, each step on stone reminding the body of the season. The dormitory offers shelter but not full comfort. Blankets matter more. Shared breathing slightly softens the air, but not enough to banish the chill. Hands are slower to warm. Faces sting in the passage from bed to church. The first touch of the floor at the bell can feel like a trial in itself. And in the church, winter changes the office physically. Voices may seem sharper in cold air. Breath may show faintly. Fingers stiffen. The familiar effort of staying awake now joins itself to the effort of standing still, while the body longs not only for sleep, but for warmth. It is in winter, perhaps more than any other season, that the monastic night most clearly reveals itself as bodily discipline. And yet winter also gives the monastery a special inwardness. The walls matter more when the fields outside are hard and dark. The lamp in the church seems brighter because the night around it is more absolute. The repeated offices feel more like a human answer to the season's vast indifference. A winter monastery is not cozy in the modern sense, but it is enclosed, held together, bound by common endurance. Now let us turn to spring. Spring does not arrive all at once in the medieval world, any more than it does in ours. It enters hesitantly, often through dampness rather than warmth. The nights may remain cold for some time, but they begin to change in texture. Frost gives way to wet ground. The air smells different. Soil loosens. Rain becomes a more frequent companion. Somewhere beyond the walls, branches begin to bud, though often before the nights have grown truly mild. A monastery at night in spring can feel softer, but also more uncertain. The road outside is less frozen and more muddy. The fields, though still dark, hold the promise of growth not yet visible in full. The cloister air is damp rather than piercing. Water gathers in corners. Stone feels moist beneath the hand. The scent of earth is stronger now, entering through openings and following hems and sandals in from the outer yards. In the dormitory, spring may bring relief from the worst winter cold, though not yet comfort. Blankets are still welcome. The bell still sounds too early, but the body, waking in the dark, senses that the year is loosening. The air no longer bites in quite the same way. Somewhere before dawn there may come, very faintly, the first signs of birdsong. This changes the emotional color of the night. Winter compresses, spring releases. The office in church is still the office, still long, still familiar, still demanding. Yet when the monks leave after matins or move through the final hours before dawn, the world outside the walls is beginning to sound alive again. Not fully, not brightly, but enough to remind them that the year, like the liturgy, moves in cycles. Death-like stillness has not won. The land is stirring. Spring nights may also bring more damp discomfort than many romantic visions allow. A wet hem, a draft thick with rain, the smell of soaked earth, the awkward heaviness of garments not quite dry. The monastery was never separate from these details. It received the weather in stone, in fabric, in skin. Then summer. Summer changes the whole logic of the night, not because the monastic routine disappears, but because darkness itself shortens. The evening may remain warm longer. The outer walls hold the day's heat for a time. The cloister after sunset can feel almost gentle. Air moves more softly. The hard edge of winter cold is gone. The guest house is less a refuge from exposure than from weariness and distance. The dormitory, though perhaps close and still not luxurious, is easier to enter. To lie down in summer is not to struggle at once against cold. And yet summer brings its own realities. Sleep may be lighter in warmth. Insects may trouble the night. The air can grow close in enclosed rooms. The body may not dread the floor's chill as it does in January, but it may still resent the bell just as strongly. In some ways, the contrast between bodily comfort and sudden obligation makes the interruption feel even more pointed. One has only just surrendered to easier sleep, and already the house is waking again. Summer also alters the church. Because the nights are shorter, the boundary between night office and morning feels thinner. Darkness may not be as deep when the monks rise. By the time the office advances, some faint anticipation of dawn may already be present at the edges of the world. A breeze moving through a high opening feels gentler. The stone does not radiate cold so fiercely. Sound still carries beautifully in the dark, but the season itself feels less severe, less testing. This can make the monastic night seem almost tender, though we should not overstate it. The office is still an office. Fatigue still exists. Repetition still governs. What changes is the climate of endurance. Summer asks less of the body in one way and perhaps more in another, especially where heat makes sleep thinner and waking more abrupt. And then autumn. Autumn may be the most meditative of all the monastery seasons at night. The year folds inward again. Days shorten. The air cools steadily. Leaves gather in corners of the cloister and outer courts. The smell of earth deepens into something richer and darker. Fields beyond the walls show the aftermath of harvest, or the preparation for what comes next. Mists become more common. The night does not yet always strike with winter's cruelty, but it carries a sense of contraction. An autumn monastery at night feels like a place remembering itself. The route from gate to cloister, from dormitory to church, seems older somehow under such conditions, not because the stones have changed, but because the season draws attention to recurrence. Another year turning, another stretch of long nights ahead, another cycle of feasts, fasts, weather, labor, and prayer. In autumn, the cemetery too may feel especially present. Wet grass, fallen leaves, markers darkened by damp. The awareness that what has grown now begins to fade, and inside the church, autumn nights may lend the chant a peculiar gravity, not more solemn in any official sense, but inwardly heavier, as though the season itself joins the psalms in speaking of time, loss, and persistence. This, perhaps, is the best way to understand the seasons in the monastery. They do not replace the rule, they inflect it. The same bell sounds in winter frost and summer softness. The same psalms are sung under spring rain and autumn mist. The same stair is climbed by men whose bodies feel the year in every joint and breath. The monastery is constant by intention. The world is changing around it all the time. That tension between constancy and season is one of the reasons monastic life held such force over long periods of history. It offered a stable rhythm without pretending to escape nature. On the contrary, it submitted that rhythm to nature's pressures every night. Cold was not symbolic, rain was not decorative, summer light was not an aesthetic effect. These were the real conditions under which obedience had to be lived. And once we understand that, we can better understand another important distinction within monastic night. Not all nights were equal. The ordinary night, with its familiar office, modest light, and repeated discipline, formed the true substance of the life. But certain nights stood apart. Feast nights. Here the routine remained, but it was intensified, adorned, expanded, and in some cases made memorable in a way the plain nights were not. This matters because when modern people imagine monasteries at night, they often picture the exceptional as if it were constant. They imagine incense and brilliant candlelight, fuller choirs, elaborate rites, heightened solemnity, and an atmosphere bordering on the theatrical. Such things did exist, but they were special precisely because most nights were not like that. An ordinary night we already know. The church dim, the chant steady, the monks tired, the office familiar, the body obedient more by practice than by excitement. A feast night changes the register. More candles burn. Light reaches farther into the church. The altar gleams more strongly. Metalwork flashes where on ordinary nights it would scarcely have been seen. Incense may drift upward and outward, giving the air a fuller presence, a sense not only of sound and shadow, but of fragrance and suspended movement. Voices may be stronger, the liturgy more elaborate, the sense of occasion unmistakable. The darkness outside the walls makes all of this feel more concentrated, as if the feast were pushing back against the night with ritual brightness. Christmas before dawn must have carried extraordinary force in such a setting. So too Easter. So too major feasts of saints beloved by the house or the wider church. On such nights, the monastery did not become another kind of place. It became itself more intensely. That is the important distinction. The extraordinary grew out of the ordinary. The monks who stood in fuller light on a feast night were the same men who had stood in near darkness on dozens of plain nights before. The voices that rose with particular energy on a high feast were trained by repetition, fatigue, and routine. The emotional power of the feast depended on the steadiness of the ordinary office that surrounded it all year. Without the 100 plain nights, the splendid night would lose much of its meaning. This is true in all ritual life, but especially here. A feast night says that the calendar itself has opened, that this moment is to be marked, honored, celebrated, remembered. But the monastery is able to make that claim convincingly because it has already taught the body and mind to honor time in the first place. Bells matter every day. Offices matter every day. Silence matters every day. Therefore, when the feast comes, the enlargement of light and sound is not decorative excess. It is a deepening of an already accepted order. And still, however splendid the feast, the night remains night. The monks are still awake before dawn. The cold, if it is winter, still enters the church. The body still tires. The candles must still be tended. The office still unfolds according to inherited form. Even the greatest feast does not abolish the bodily truth of monastic life. It crowns it for a time. Then the feast passes. The church grows dimmer on the next ordinary night. The familiar psalms return in their simpler setting. The routine goes on. And in that return, the deep character of the monastery shows itself once again, not in singular moments, but in repeated ones. Now, as our walk approaches the final hours before dawn, the darkness begins to change almost imperceptibly. Not yet day, not even what we would call early morning, perhaps. But some subtle shift has begun. The office in church moves toward its conclusion. Voices that have sounded into the dark for what feels like a long time now begin to draw the night toward its next threshold. The monks, who rose from the dormitory in the hardest depth of sleep, have passed through prayer together. Their bodies are no less human than before. They may now feel even more tired. Yet the night has been divided, sanctified, endured. Outside, if one stepped into the cloister or to some outer court, the sky would still be dark, but perhaps less impenetrably so. The darkness thins first, not in brightness, but in texture. Edges become slightly more available to the eye. The air before dawn often feels colder, and this too the monks would have known well. The deepest part of night's chill can come just before the first release of morning. A listener who has ever risen very early in winter will understand this. One expects improvement and receives briefly a sharper cold instead. In such an hour, the monastery is poised between worlds. Behind it lies the first sleep, the bell, the dark procession, the long office. Ahead lies whatever the next portion of the day will require. Perhaps a brief return to bed depending on custom and season. Perhaps movement toward the first true signs of dawn. Perhaps the next office, the next task, the next meal, the next cycle of labor and prayer. The monastery does not really distinguish night from day the way most of us do. It binds them together in sequence. This is why the final hours before dawn feel so significant. They reveal that the monastic night is not an isolated episode. It is a link in a chain. The monks do not awaken for a beautiful interruption and then return to ordinary life. The interruption is ordinary life. Night prayer is not set apart from the rest of the day as an ornament. It is one articulation of the same disciplined continuum. As the church quiets, or as the community begins to leave it, the sounds are softer than before. Tiredness has deepened. The body has done more than it wished to do. Footsteps in the passage back from the choir carry a different weight now than the footsteps that came into the church from sleep. Those earlier steps were reluctant and incomplete. These are steadier, though perhaps heavier. The office has been accomplished. The obligation has been met. The rhythm continues. If this were spring or summer, perhaps a bird sounds faintly somewhere beyond the walls. If winter, perhaps only wind. If autumn, perhaps damp silence and the smell of cold earth. In every case, morning remains not yet present, but nearly imaginable. And that nearness today is where the deeper meaning of the monastic night comes most fully into view. Because what the monastery is doing in these final hours is not merely surviving the dark. It is giving the dark a form. That may be the deepest truth in all we have seen. A medieval monastery at night was cold, yes. It was repetitive. It could be uncomfortable, wearying, and physically severe. It was full of limitations modern people would find hard to accept. Privacy was slight. Sleep was broken. Warmth was scarce. Silence was enforced. The body was not consulted as the highest authority. And yet none of this was accidental. The monks did not endure such nights simply because they had no better arrangement. They endured them because within the logic of their life, the night itself was something to be shaped by prayer, obedience, and communal order. That is why the bell mattered. That is why the church mattered. That is why the route from bed to choir, repeated in every season, became so central to the meaning of the life. Night in the monastery was not empty time between one day and the next. It was claimed time. The world outside the walls lay mostly unstructured in darkness. Villages slept, roads emptied, fields vanished, travelers stopped where they could, animals shifted in stalls, fires burned low, human life withdrew into shelter and waited for light. But the monastery did something unusual. It rose into the dark and answered it. Not with noise, not with conquest, not with comfort, but with a pattern, a bell, a gathering, a chant, a return. Again and again, year after year, this gave the monks a particular relation to time itself. Most people experience time through necessity, interruption, labor, hunger, weather, family, and opportunity. The monks knew all of those things too, but over and within them was laid another system, the hours of prayer. And because one of those hours came in the middle of the night, when the body most desired oblivion, the whole system made a serious claim. It said that no hour belonged entirely to instinct. Even sleep could be entered and left according to a sacred order. This is one reason monastic life can seem at once admirable and severe. It asks a question many of us would rather avoid. What would happen if comfort were no longer our first guide? What would a life look like if repetition, discipline, and shared ritual mattered more than preference? The monastery's answer is written most clearly in the night. There, stripped of daylight's distractions, the shape of the life appears with unusual sharpness. Men lie down together. Men rise together. Men walk half awake through darkened stone. Men stand in choir and recite words older than themselves. Men submit the weakness of the body to an inherited pattern, not perfectly, not always joyfully, but persistently. And from that persistence comes identity. A monk is not defined only by what he believes. He is defined by what he does repeatedly, especially when the doing is difficult. Night makes this plain. One can speak of devotion in daylight and still remain largely untested. One can admire a rule and find it agreeable when the sun is up. The meal has been taken and the body feels capable. But to hear the bell in the middle of a winter night, to leave a rough blanket, to cross a cold floor, to move into a dark church and begin again the familiar office, that is where ideals become habits or fail to become them. Of course, no monastery achieved its ideal perfectly. No community of human beings ever does. There would have been sleepy inattentiveness, inward complaint, occasional resentment, uneven zeal, frailty, lapses, impatience. perhaps quiet acts of kindness unrecorded, and quiet acts of pettiness equally unrecorded. The medieval monastery was not made of symbols, it was made of men, and men are mixed creatures. But that does not weaken the significance of the night routine. If anything, it strengthens it, because the value of the monastic night lies not in proving that the monks were above ordinary human difficulty, but in showing what ordinary human difficulty looked like when given a religious form. They did not cease to be tired, cold, distracted, aging, or vulnerable. They brought all of that with them into the choir. The office was not what remained after human weakness had been removed. It was what took place in the midst of it. That is why the image is so enduring. Not because it is picturesque, though at times it certainly could be beautiful. Not because it is strange, though to modern sensibilities it often is, but because it brings together elements we rarely hold together now: weariness and devotion, routine and meaning, bodily hardship and communal identity, darkness and structure. The monastery knew that the night could produce fear, confusion, temptation, loneliness, and vulnerability. Medieval people were not naive about darkness. They knew how much could go wrong in it. A spark could become a fire. A sickness could worsen. A traveler could lose the road. A storm could intensify. The mind itself could turn inward in unhelpful ways. The monastery did not deny those possibilities. Instead, it set prayer against them. It made wakefulness an answer. There is something deeply human in that. To wake and sing before dawn is, in one sense, impractical. In another sense, it is one of the most practical things a religious community can do, because it trains its members to understand that life is not governed only by convenience. Some goods must be chosen against comfort if they are to become real. This, perhaps, is the final interpretive key to monastic night. Its meaning does not lie in darkness alone, nor in candles, nor in chant, nor even in the beauty of old stone. Its meaning lies in repetition that forms the person. The monk who has lived many years in such a house is different not simply because he has spent many hours praying, but because he has spent many nights answering the same call. The bell enters the soul through the body. The route to church enters the memory through the feet. Silence enters the heart through the discipline of the tongue. Community enters identity through shared inconvenience as much as through shared belief. And once one sees this, the monastery becomes less mysterious and more impressive. It is not impressive because it is exotic. It is impressive because it organized the hardest parts of ordinary life into a rule that could be lived together. Darkness, cold, sleep, fatigue, age, sickness, monotony. These are not romantic themes. Yet the monastery made them central, and by doing so transformed them into vehicles of meaning. Now the night is nearing its end, not ended yet, but changed. The office has been completed, or nearly so. The church has done what the church was meant to do in the dark. The chant has risen and fallen. The candles have held their small circles of light against the great surrounding shadow. The monks have stood, listened, responded, and endured. The burial ground outside remains still. The infirmary keeps its quieter rhythm. The guest house lies at the edge of all this, touched by it, but not fully inside it. And the first subtle nearness of morning begins to gather beyond the walls. So let us leave the church now and walk back out through the monastery one final time. The movement is slow. The urgency of the bell is gone. The feet that carry us now are tired feet, but practiced ones. The church behind us grows quieter as we pass from its immediate sound into the adjoining spaces. The passage feels less severe than it did when we entered half asleep, though perhaps only because the body has now accepted its burden for the hour. The darkness is still present, yet it has changed character. It no longer feels like the untouched depth of midnight. It feels like a night that has been worked through. The cloister receives us again. Its paving stones are cold beneath the foot. Its arches remain dark. The central space still holds whatever the sky chooses to give it: stars, cloud, or nothing visible at all. But there is a difference now. We know the cloister better than we did when we first entered. We have passed through the outer gate, the guest house, the refectory, the service rooms, the dormitory, the church, the infirmary, the burial ground, and the seasonal weather of the whole monastic year. The cloister is no longer simply a beautiful architectural form. It is the silent crossroads of a life. From here, the buildings rest in their places. The refectory remains empty, waiting for another appointed hour. The kitchen embers, if any still survive, are hidden low. The dormitory waits to receive returning bodies, whether briefly or until the next movement of the day, according to the custom we imagine. The gatehouse remains shut against the outer road. The cemetery lies still. Everything is where it ought to be. And perhaps that is the final feeling a real monastery at night would leave upon the mind. Not excitement, not mystery in the theatrical sense, but order, severe, sometimes wearying, sometimes beautiful order. A world in which every important thing had its place, and even the darkness was not allowed to remain formless. If we continue outward, passing again toward the gate, we can feel the difference between inside and outside as strongly as we did at the beginning, perhaps more strongly now. The outer world is still there with all its uncertainties. Villages and fields, roads and weather, trade and labor, danger and ordinary sleep. The monastery has not abolished any of that. It has simply drawn a boundary within which another rhythm governs. At the gate, one could almost forget how much has taken place while the rest of the countryside slept. A stranger passing beyond the walls in the deepest part of the night might have seen only darkness, perhaps a faint light at one high opening, perhaps heard a distant bell, or a current of chant too faint to understand. He might have thought the monastery silent, or almost so. He would not have known how many bodies had risen from rough beds, how many cold feet had crossed stone, how many familiar words had been spoken into the dark, how many small acts of obedience had already shaped the coming day before dawn had even appeared. That hiddenness is part of the meaning, too. Much of monastic life happened out of sight. Its power was not public spectacle, but repeated invisibility. Night prayer was rarely seen by the world. It did not seek applause. The work of discipline often disappears from ordinary notice. Yet it is precisely such hidden work that forms a life most deeply. And now, beyond the gate again, let us stand for one last moment on the outer road. The monastery is behind us. Its walls, roofs, tower if it has one, and silent ranges of buildings gather themselves against the dark. Somewhere within, the community remains enclosed in its pattern of prayer and rest. Morning is approaching, but not yet here. The sky is only beginning to imagine light. The fields are still indistinct. The road is still quiet. The same distant world of farms, villages, woods, and uncertain travel surrounds the monastery as it always has. Yet something inside those walls has already answered the night. That is the truth to carry away. What were nights really like in a medieval monastery? They were dark. They were cold. They were communal. They were disciplined. They were broken by bells and shaped by prayer. They were lived in stone and silence, in rough blankets and worn stairs, in chant and tiredness, in the nearness of sickness, in the memory of the dead, in the turn of seasons, in the contrast between ordinary nights and feast nights, in the long repetition that made one night resemble the last and prepared the soul, at least in hope, for the next. They were not fantasy. They were not constant drama. They were not a torchlit world of endless ceremony. They were harder, plainer, and in some ways more remarkable than that. They were a way of giving form to darkness, and as dawn slowly approaches over the fields, the monastery remains what it has been all night, a place where time is heard in bells, where the body is taught by repetition, and where even in the deepest hours before morning, the world is met not with noise, but with ordered prayer. And if we remain a little longer on that outer road, before the first true light spreads across the land, one more thought comes quietly into view. What makes the medieval monastery at night so striking is not that it was cut off from ordinary life. It was full of ordinary life. Not ordinary in the sense of casual or modern, but ordinary in the oldest human sense. Men grew tired here. Men felt cold here. Men worried, aged, fell ill, recovered, endured, remembered, and died here. Meals had to be cooked, floors had to be crossed, fires had to be watched, blankets had to be pulled close. Sleep came and was interrupted. Morning always returned, and yet all of those ordinary things were gathered into a pattern that gave them meaning. That is why the monastery can seem so distant from us, and so strangely familiar at the same time. We know what it is to be tired. We know what it is to wake before we wish to wake. We know what it is to move through darkness, to feel the difference between shelter and exposure, to listen more carefully when sight is limited, to notice how silence changes the mind. But we do not always know what it is to place those experiences inside a rule and let that rule shape the whole self over many years. The monk did, or tried to, and in that attempt lies much of the dignity of the monastic night. It is easy to admire grand achievements that happen once. It is harder, and perhaps wiser, to admire the humble achievement of doing the same difficult thing over and over again until it becomes part of one's nature. That is what the monastery asked. Not brilliance, night after night. Not ecstasy, night after night. Not unusual heroism, night after night. Only this: rise when called, go where you must go, stand where you must stand, pray the words that have been given, return when the office is done, sleep again if allowed, wake again when required, endure the season, endure the body, endure the repetition, and in enduring it, become someone formed by it. There is a great gentleness hidden inside such severity. That may sound strange, but it is true. A life governed by rhythm can be harsh, yet also merciful in its own way, because it does not require each person to invent meaning from nothing each day. The monk waking at night does not ask himself what the hour is for. The hour has already been claimed. He is tired, but he is not directionless. He is cold, but he is not abandoned to chance. He belongs to a pattern larger than his present feeling. For many people, perhaps especially in later life, there is something deeply calming in that thought. Not the hardship itself, not the cold stone, the rough blanket, the interrupted rest, but the sense that time could be given shape and that one did not need to negotiate every moment anew. The monastery's night says, in effect, that even darkness can have a structure. Even wakefulness at the wrong hour can have a place. Even repetition can become meaningful. That is one reason the old monastic world still draws the imagination. Not because most people would choose to live exactly as those monks lived. Few would. But because their life reveals something we often forget. That routine is not always the enemy of meaning. Sometimes routine is the vessel that carries meaning when feeling has gone quiet. The monk standing at Matins in the cold may not be inspired. He may not be inwardly lifted. He may not feel anything especially noble. But he stands. And that standing matters. It matters because it joins him to the others. It matters because it answers the bell. It matters because the body learns from acts the mind alone cannot sustain. And perhaps, over years, it matters because such acts become the hidden architecture of character. So when we imagine the monastery at night, we should not imagine only spectacle, though there were moments of beauty. We should imagine steadiness, a hand finding the wall in darkness, feet moving over the same stones, a voice entering a psalm already known by heart, a candle burning low and steadily, a cough from the infirmary, a draught through the cloister, a sleeper turning beneath a rough cover, a star above the cemetery, a bell sounding across the enclosed world. These small things are the true materials of the night. And because they are small, repeated, and shared, they create an atmosphere unlike almost any we know now. A modern person often experiences the night as private time. One stays up late alone. One reads, watches, worries, remembers, scrolls, thinks, drifts, or sleeps according to personal need. The monastic night was not private in that way. Even in sleep, it was communal. Even in darkness, it was ordered. Even in silence, it was full of the presence of others living by the same rule. That shared condition must have changed the emotional weight of the night profoundly. To wake alone in darkness is one thing. To wake because a whole community wakes with you is another. To feel cold alone is one thing. To feel it as part of a common discipline is another. To hear a bell only as a sound is one thing. To hear it as a call, everyone around you also understands, is another. The monastery turned night from an individual experience into a collective one. That collective life did not erase loneliness, no doubt. Human beings remain inwardly separate in many ways no matter where they live. But it did mean that the basic movements of the night were shared, and shared so often that they became part of the house itself. The walls almost seem to remember them. The stair remembers. The choir stalls remember. The cloister paving remembers. The burial ground remembers in its own silence. The whole monastery becomes a record of repeated nights. And that too is worth carrying away as we end our walk. A monastery is not only built by masons and carpenters. It is built by habits. It is made not only of stone and timber, but of repeated actions performed across generations. One group of monks ages and dies. Another arrives. Yet the bell sounds. The office continues. The route from dormitory to church is worn deeper. The memory of the house thickens. Night after night, the life inscribes itself into the place. That is why old monastic ruins, even roofless and empty, can still seem full of something. Not ghosts, not fantasy, but the residue of repetition. A cloister without monks still suggests pacing feet. A chapter house still suggests gathered listening. A dormitory range still suggests communal sleep. A church still suggests voices in pre-dawn dark. Architecture remembers use. And nowhere is that use more powerful to imagine than at night, when the visible world narrows and repeated action becomes the main form of meaning. Now the sky ahead is beginning, very faintly, to loosen. Not brighten yet, not fully, but loosen. The blackness over the fields is no longer absolute. There is the slightest separation between earth and air. A line of trees can almost be guessed. The road underfoot can be followed with less uncertainty than before. Somewhere a bird may call once. Somewhere a farm animal shifts in the distance. The world outside the monastery, which seemed suspended in sleep, is preparing to resume its own day. Inside the walls, of course, the monastery has never truly ceased. That is the final distinction. Ordinary life outside often stops at night and begins again in the morning. Monastic life changes shape, but does not stop. That is why its nights feel so dense with meaning. They are not pauses in the life. They are part of the life's fullest expression. So as light begins to gather at the edge of the world, the monastery stands behind us, not as a place that escaped the night, but as a place that inhabited it deliberately. And perhaps that is why it remains memorable. The medieval monastery did not conquer darkness. It kept faith within it. It did not make the body irrelevant. It trained the body through repeated acts. It did not remove suffering, frailty, age, weather, or death. It placed them inside a communal rhythm and answered them with order, prayer, and endurance. That is what nights were really like in a medieval monastery. Not magical, not comfortable, not endlessly dramatic, but profound in the way repeated human acts can become profound when they are taken seriously enough. And now, with the monastery behind us and the field slowly reappearing before us, we can let the image rest. The gate closed, the cloister silent, the dormitory dim, the bell sounding, the church awake, the chant rising, the candles small and steady, the infirmary quiet, the graves waiting under the sky, the seasons turning over the same stones, the monks moving through darkness together, and dawn, always somewhere ahead. And that approaching dawn, faint though it is, helps us understand one final contrast. The monastery was a place apart, but never a place outside time. Its walls enclosed a community. They did not suspend the movement of age, weather, memory, or mortality. If anything, the monastic night made those things easier to feel. A long, wakeful office teaches a person that the body is limited. A cold corridor teaches a person that comfort is fragile. A shared dormitory teaches a person that life is not lived alone. A burial ground beside the church teaches a person that every routine, however stable, is held beneath the shadow of an ending. And yet nothing in the monastery encouraged despair. Sobriety, yes. Humility, certainly. But not despair, because the point of the night office was not simply to acknowledge darkness. It was to answer it, to keep a form, to return, once more, to words and gestures larger than one's present mood. This is why the night must have felt different to a monk after many years than it did to a novice in his first months. A novice would notice the hardships sharply, the cold, the interruption of sleep, the unfamiliar discipline of silence, the awkwardness of communal rest, the length of the office when tired, the ache of standing, the strangeness of rising while the world still sleeps. All of this would press itself upon him with particular force because it would still be new. But over years, novelty would fade and something else would take its place. Habit, not dullness exactly, though dullness no doubt came at times, more like a deepening groove in the self. The bell would cease to be merely an external demand and become part of expectation. The route through darkness would no longer need active thought. The Psalms would live in memory. The body might still resist, but it would resist inside a pattern now familiar enough to hold it. This is what monastic formation really means in the night. Not the sudden transformation of a person into someone effortlessly holy, but the gradual making of a human life through repeated actions carried out under shared discipline. And because those actions happened in darkness so often, the night itself became one of the great teachers of the monastery. It taught patience. It taught endurance. It taught the limits of feeling. It taught that prayer is not always a matter of inspiration. It taught that community is proven as much by shared inconvenience as by shared ideals. And perhaps, most of all, it taught that time itself can be offered back in pieces. An hour before dawn, a psalm in the cold, a walk across stone, a return to bed, a second rising, a meal at the proper time, work in daylight, then evening again, then night once more. The whole life turned in circles, but not empty circles. Circles filled with meaning because they were consciously repeated. For a modern listener, this may be one of the most surprising things about the medieval monastery. So much of modern life values variety, choice, novelty, and self-direction. The monastery valued stability, repetition, and surrender to a form already given. That did not make the monks less human. It made them human in a different key. Their nights were not an escape from ordinary weakness. They were the setting in which weakness was acknowledged and trained. That is a very different vision of human flourishing from the one many people assume now. It suggests that a good life may not always feel spacious in the modern sense. It may feel narrow at times, demanding, even uncomfortable. And yet within that narrowness there may be depth, within that demand, character, within that discomfort, a freedom from the endless burden of deciding anew who one will be each hour. The monk at night does not invent himself. He returns to a pattern. And in returning, he is slowly made. This is perhaps why even those who would never wish to live in a monastery can still find something restful in imagining it. Not restful because the life was easy. It was not easy. But restful because it had shape, because every hour belonged somewhere, because even fatigue was not meaningless, because the same darkness that might feel empty elsewhere was filled here with known actions, known words, known companions, known responsibilities, and known hopes. That sense of shape is hard to overestimate. A person can bear a great deal if suffering is given a form. Cold is easier to endure when it is shared and expected. Wakefulness is easier to endure when it is purposeful. Silence is easier to endure when it is part of a common rule rather than mere isolation. The monastery did not remove hardship. It distributed hardship into a framework, and framework is one of the deepest human needs. At night, when the mind is more vulnerable and the body more honest, that need becomes clearer than at any other time. Perhaps that is one reason why the old monastic traditions gave so much attention to nocturnal prayer. Night strips away illusions. It leaves fewer distractions. The self is less defended then, more tired, more truthful, more dependent. To pray in that condition is to admit that one is not strongest when one comes before God. One comes as one is, sleepy, cold, half willing, half reluctant. And still one comes. There is something quietly moving in that, not heroic in the bright public sense, more private than heroism, more repetitive, more humble, and perhaps more durable. 1,000 ordinary risings in the dark may shape a soul more deeply than one grand dramatic act ever could. That is what the monastery seems to have understood. The grand act is rare. The ordinary act is daily. build the life out of daily acts, and the soul will take their shape. So the monks rose, and sang, and returned, and rose again. And over years the monastery itself became the material trace of all that repetition. The stair worn by feet, the choir stalls polished by hands, the paving stones smoothed at the center, the door latch touched every night, the refectory emptied and filled, the dormitory settled and stirred, the cemetery growing quietly beside all this movement. The whole place became time made visible. And when we ask what nights were really like in a medieval monastery, that may be the most complete answer of all. They were nights in which time became tangible, not abstract hours passing unnoticed, not blank darkness waiting for dawn, but hours marked, divided, answered, inhabited, hours with a bell at their center, hours with a root, hours with a duty, hours with words, hours with silence, hours with cold, and with breath and with memory, hours that returned so often they entered the stone itself. Now the light before us is stronger than it was, still gentle, still early, but enough to begin dissolving the last uncertainty in the fields. The world beyond the monastery resumes its broader human day. Smoke will rise from hearths, animals will be fed, travelers will take up the road, laborers will step into fields or workshops, markets and households will begin to stir. And the monastery, though it may seem from outside to have simply endured another night in silence, has already lived through a complete sequence of prayer and waking that most of the world never saw. That hidden life is part of its power. It reminds us that not everything meaningful is visible. Not everything formative is dramatic. Not everything sacred appears under bright light. Some of the deepest things happen while most people sleep. A man rises because a bell calls him. He walks through darkness. He sings ancient words with others. He returns to the common life. No one outside may ever know. Yet he is changed by it. The house is sustained by it. The tradition continues through it. That is enough. And so, as the night finally loosens into morning, we can leave the monastery where it belongs, behind its walls, within its silence, held inside its rhythm of rest and prayer, a place where darkness was never merely darkness, a place where even sleep was part of discipline, a place where the bell entered the body and the body carried prayer, a place where stone, season, voice, and repetition joined to make an entire way of life. And if we keep that image clearly in mind, then we know, perhaps as well as we can know from this distance, what nights were really like in a medieval monastery.